The countryside of Cambodia should have been alive with sound in the late 1970s. Wind across the rice fields, ox carts groaning along dirt tracks, the chatter of children at play. Instead, a silence spread that was heavier than any sound. In the fields outside Phnom Penh and across the provinces, the ground itself became a graveyard. After each rain, bones rose through the earth, fragments of clothing surfaced, skulls stared back from the soil. Survivors came to call them the Killing Fields. Between 1975 and 1979, under the regime of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, nearly 2 million people were executed, starved, or worked to death. It was a genocide carried out not with bombs or invading armies, but by a government against its own people. The Khmer Rouge had grown from a radical communist movement. Their leader, Pol Pot, born Saloth Sar, had studied in Paris, where he was drawn to Marxist-Leninist theories and visions of agrarian utopias. To him, Cambodia had been corrupted by city life, foreign influence, and class divisions. He imagined a society where everyone lived as peasants, working the land in equality, stripped of property, religion, and even family ties. To create it, he and his followers decided they would tear Cambodia down to nothing and build again from the ruins. In April 1975, Phnom Penh fell. After years of civil war, the black-clad soldiers of the Khmer Rouge marched into the capital. To many Cambodians, they looked like saviors, promising peace after American bombings and decades of chaos. But within hours, loudspeakers blared across the city. Phnom Penh must be emptied immediately. Doctors and nurses were ordered to leave hospitals. Families were told to abandon their homes, taking only what they could carry. Soldiers shouted that the Americans were about to bomb the city and that evacuation was temporary. It was a lie. Under the burning sun, 2 million people were driven into the countryside at gunpoint. Elderly men collapsed in the streets, mothers carried newborns in their arms. Children cried as they staggered along the highways. Those who resisted were shot where they stood. The Khmer Rouge called it Year Zero. Civilization, they declared, was beginning again. Money was abolished, schools closed, religion outlawed, families were separated into labor brigades. The very act of holding on to the past, an old photo, a book, even a memory spoken aloud, could mark someone for death. Life in the countryside became a living hell. City dwellers with no farming experience were forced to work endless hours in rice paddies. The sun beat down, tools broke, hands blistered and bled. Rations were meager, a ladle of watery rice porridge, sometimes mixed with leaves or insects. Starvation was everywhere. People searched fields for crickets or snails to survive, but if caught, they could be beaten or executed for stealing from the collective. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion claimed lives daily. At night, workers collapsed in their huts, too weak to speak. Families whispered prayers into the darkness, though even that was forbidden. The Khmer Rouge ruled through paranoia. They saw enemies everywhere, traitors, spies, intellectuals. Wearing glasses could be a death sentence, a sign you could read. Speaking a foreign language, practicing Buddhism, or even asking too many questions marked you as dangerous. The regime established a network of prisons they called re-education centers. In truth, they were torture chambers. The most infamous was Tuol Sleng, or S21, a former school in Phnom Penh, converted into a place of terror. Prisoners were shackled in cells, beaten with whips and rifle butts, subjected to electric shocks, starved until they confessed to crimes they had never committed. The confessions were written down, signed, and filed away, a grotesque formality before execution. Once condemned, prisoners were trucked to the killing fields. At Chong Ek and dozens of other sites, they were marched blindfolded to the edge of pits already dug in the earth. Ammunition was too valuable to waste. Guards killed with shovels, hoes, clubs, and sharpened bamboo. Babies were swung against trees. Loudspeakers played revolutionary songs to mask the cries. In the morning, the pits were covered with dirt, but after rain, the ground bled back reminders of what had been buried. Ethnic minorities were special targets. The Cham Muslim community, the Chinese Cambodians, the Vietnamese, all were marked for elimination. Buddhist monks, once the spiritual backbone of Cambodia, were defrocked and slaughtered. Artists, teachers, doctors, engineers, anyone whose knowledge belonged to the world before year zero, were destroyed. Even members of the Khmer Rouge themselves were purged in waves of suspicion. One cadre might be celebrated one day and shackled the next, tortured into a confession, and thrown into the same mass graves as those he once guarded. The death toll mounted. By 1979, nearly 2 million were gone, 1 out of every 4 Cambodians. The scale of loss hollowed the nation. Villages had no elders, families had no fathers, no mothers. Children wandered without kin. Those who survived lived in terror, gaunt from hunger, haunted by the memory of neighbors led away and never seen again. Beyond Cambodia, the world saw little. Journalists had been expelled, foreigners were barred. Only fragments of testimony escaped through refugees who fled across the Thai border. Many outsiders doubted the reports. The truth seemed too monstrous to believe. It was only after the Vietnamese army invaded Cambodia in late 1978, toppling Pol Pot's regime in January 1979, that the nightmare was exposed in full. Soldiers and journalists walked into silent fields where bones lay scattered, into prisons where thousands of photographs of victims were left behind. The evidence was undeniable. At Choeung Ek alone, more than 20,000 people were executed and buried in shallow graves. Today, a memorial stupa filled with skulls rises there, each one a face that once belonged to a life cut short. At Tuol Sleng, the walls are lined with the mugshots of men, women, and children taken just before they were tortured and killed. The images stare out in silence, haunting reminders of humanity stripped bare. The aftermath dragged on for decades. Cambodia was shattered. Survivors carried trauma that words could barely capture. Fields were empty, schools ruined, temples desecrated. It would take generations for the country to recover. Trials against Khmer Rouge leaders moved slowly. Only a few high-ranking officials were ever convicted of crimes against humanity. Pol Pot himself lived in the jungle, unrepentant, and died in 1998 without ever facing a judge. For many survivors, justice never came. Yet Cambodia remembers. Each year, ceremonies honor the dead. The killing fields remain as both grave and classroom, teaching new generations what unchecked ideology can do. Visitors walk along paths where fragments of bone still surface after rain. They see the tree where children were murdered, the pits where thousands were buried, the silence that still clings to the air. The killing fields reveal the fragility of civilization. They show how swiftly society can collapse when power is absolute and dissent erased. The victims were not soldiers in battle. They were ordinary people, farmers, monks, children, mothers. They were erased because a regime decided their existence stood in the way of its dream. Between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge tried to erase a nation. They failed, but they left behind a scar carved deep into the earth and into memory. The fields are quiet now, but the quiet is not peace. It is the echo of millions of voices silenced, and a warning of how ideology twisted into extremism can turn neighbors into executioners. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.